Okay, this unit went really fast, and there's a handful of little details that are left over for you to note. These would be scattered, I think, throughout your study guide, on top of your study guide, and so on. First of all, a vocab term, night soil, is human poop that is composted. And technically, that's excellent manure. Humans have a really diverse diet, and we're pretty well pampered. We have reshaped the entire planet to feed us a diversified diet, and so our poop actually does make top-notch manure. It was called night soil because everybody would empty their bedpans while it was still dark, so you would like not show your neighbors your poop, and so you would be adding to the soil at night, the soil that you add at night, the night soil, the poop. First thing to emphasize, that would be spectacular in terms of the quality of the manure, except for one problem. At the municipal level, most of us developed nations aggregate too many heavy metals in our diet, like all the tuna biomagnification issues, enough to make our compost hazardous when you apply it on a farm. You are not allowed by food producer standards to use that because our compost that you get from our poop has too many heavy metals from our diet, biomagnification, and too many drugs. Not all necessarily bad drugs, but you know, like my wife had chemo. Like her biological waste would have been dangerous, toxic. It was designed to kill stuff in her body. That's not something that you would want to put back onto farmland or whatever. So what's fascinating is if you had a normal, let's say a healthy enough diet, we should be composting poop. And someday, if you want to talk about it, we composted poop when we were living in the mountains for many years. You can get composting toilets, and it is doable. But at the municipal level, we really can't do that. At the systemic level, I left night soil for the end because hopefully you've already seen the slide about integrated waste management, and you might remember that there was systemic recovery at the very end. We should harvest nutrients and stuff, but we just can't harvest the night soil anymore. Historically, farmers used poop of all sorts to fertilize their fields. Now we really shouldn't. If you ever want to talk about this, I have a lot of stories about this. All right. Number 20, not rocket surgery. There's a lot of different ways to break this up. So in other books, you might see the food waste and the yard trimmings clumped together. Paper is sometimes clumped together with cardboard and sometimes not. But it's kind of shocking that paper is still number one in our waste stream. And I should give you a hint that in Santa Barbara it isn't. We recycle more of it. And in California it's no longer number one. But nationwide and worldwide, paper is still the number one ingredient in our waste stream. And if you look at the others, food waste, yard trimmings, plastics, and metals, the top five, about 90-odd% of the stuff that we throw in the trash is perfectly recyclable or compostable. Like, those are resources. This isn't nice to think about, but a lot of people pick through trash. Like, there's stuff in there that's worth it. And I just keep thinking how stupid the system is. That's all. Like the reason I put these is, the College Board does need you to know that it's paper. And I'm just a little bit shocked. Like, what the heck are we doing that we're throwing away all this good stuff? I'm definitely a scavenger. You probably know that by now. For number 21, your book is fine. It's just like defining hazardous materials. Defining the methods that are used for disposal, right? Open dumps and ocean dumping and stuff. In the US, the primary thing is landfills, but globally, open dumping is the most common, meaning you just make a pile. It's not a sanitary landfill, it's a unmanaged landfill. And ocean dumping is really common because the things you leave outside, if they're unmanaged, will usually end up in the ocean. Right? If it's not covered up with dirt, water and wind are going to carry it away. Now, number 24, I have a lot to talk about, so please get ready for notes. Hazardous material comes in all sorts, solid, gas, liquid, and what makes it hazardous material is that if it interacts with water and reaches your body, or if it interacts with the soil and then your food and then reaches your body, hazardous materials are bad for you. That's the whole point. It's interesting to point out that most hazardous material has a dosage limit, right? Like drugs and cigarettes and everything else. And so we got to be really careful that we don't panic too much about hazmat, because like the paint used in my mug is probably hazardous, but I don't drink gallons of this paint, so it's okay for me to drink from this mug. And there's a bazillion, like if you Google the dirtiest industries, you'll probably get a different list. But I want to give you an acronym that makes it easy to remember, like to give you a big red light, like a blinking light, like, whoa, that's going to be a dirty industry. I want you to know the 5 Ps: petroleum, plastic, pesticide, pharmaceuticals, and paint/pigment. Petroleum primarily because of the extraction, the refineries, don't forget, all those accidents. Plastic would not be that bad if we could just recycle it, but the real problem with plastic is we suck at throwing it away in the right place. So plastic is a really polluting industry because we are a polluting species, if you know what I mean. All over the world, people are stupid about how they handle plastic. Pesticides are a really heavy hazardous material. And again, not by the time you eat the apple. Remember that. What's hazardous about pesticide is the ecosystems around farms and the humans who live or work in or near the farms. Pharmaceuticals and pigment paint, these are just industrial chemistry. And there's just a lot of waste products when you're doing, giant volumes of chemistry at one time. Like the net volume of paint, pigment, pharmaceuticals is gigantor. So I want you to remember the scale of those. And as a fun fact, if you're looking for what's actually the surprisingly most polluting industry, fashion is pretty far up there. Clothing. If you take the fashion industry globally, it would be the 7th largest country. $2.4 trillion are the global fashion trade covering our bodies. And it's maybe not surprising because a whole bunch of pesticides are used to grow the crops that become our clothing. Cotton is the most polluting crop we grow in large scales. A lot of our clothing is made with plastics, all polyester, all stretchy stuff, all lycra, spandex, that's all plastic. There's a whole bunch of petroleum used because of all the international shipping and stuff. There's no pharmaceuticals in your clothing, but there sure are a lot of paints and pigments in your clothing. And so actually the one industry that is fed by the dirtiest waste streams is fashion. That's why I get really frustrated when people try to show off how environmental they are by their clothing. Because I'm like, dude, that clothing itself is one of the least environmental things you can do. Like, I always think the most environmental thing is when somebody's wearing rags or wearing really, really cheap whatever they could get so that they can spend their money on things that make a difference. I think that that's really environmental. All right, but anyway, if we're talking about hazardous material, I have to tell you a story, which I've been dying to fit into our course somewhere. It's super famous, and the College Board needs you to know about Love Canal. Oh, sorry. The College Board needs you to know about Love Canal. The story's endless. I'm going to try to give you the really fast cliff notes. But basically, a chemical company owned a little bit of land where they used to bury chemical waste for about 30, 40, 20, I can't remember. For an extended period of time, this chemical company used to bury their waste. They were trying to run it as a landfill. There weren't a lot of rules about landfills back then. And this chemical company, just doing chemical stuff, buried about 20,000 tons of chemical in barrels. Now that we know what went into the ground, it turns out that basically everything that they were burying was a known carcinogen, are now known to be carcinogenic, excuse me. The land was abandoned, the company went out of business, there was this economic collapse, the town sort of dissolved and then it reformed, and the land was just land. Like, stuff happened in the past, you know, like a haunted house, like nobody really knows who the ghost is. Same story. And so as this land was, you know, for a minute it was owned by someone who never saw it. Then it was owned by the descendant of someone who never knew the previous owner and never saw it. Then it was just gifted to the city, like, no, you can just keep this. I don't want this land. Then the city was like, yo, anybody remember what this land is? And sometime in the future, the city's starting to grow, the economy takes off, the city's like, yo, we got to build some schools, and somebody's like, oh, hey, what's that thing on the map? And so they built a school on it. Matter of fact, they built another school like 6 blocks away. And there was a creek right there, Love Canal. There was a creek right there, and like, it gets really hot, so in the summer everybody used to go to the creek to swim. And at some point all those barrels in the ground just started to rust and rupture. And like, people describe in the winter, these pools of groundwater would be exposed in the low spots around town. Like, somebody would be digging a basement, and in the winter there was so much rain, it's right next to Niagara Falls, there was so much rain that the groundwater would surface, and those pools would have like a sheen on top, like you get when you spill gasoline or oil on the ground. Basically, the community was steeped in chemical waste. Like, you can imagine why this is a famous story. There was a period there in the early middle 70s where a majority of children were born with deformities. There was one year where 18 of 22 kids were born with some kind of severe deformity. This is like gnarly. Cancer started to become extremely common, mostly affecting pregnant women, their fetuses, and children. Like, all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, your kid has that cancer, my kid has that cancer. The doctor's like, wait, there's 2 people in the same town with this cancer? And people be like, I got it too. And those cancers have an incidence of like 1 in 10 million globally or whatever. Like, something weird's going on. Property values start to collapse. Nobody wants to buy a house in toxic town. with property values collapsing, social services start to collapse. They have to start closing the schools and the fire department, and the police, and crime become rampant. And like everybody's just stuck in this town where their kids are dying. And nobody's responsible. This was a big whoop. There was this like community outrage. Everybody was pissed. Really famous demonstrations. Like, if you care about demonstration, and political resistance is very important, and you should learn how to do it well, you've got to study Love Canal. Because basically a bunch of people who were not activists had zero support from politicians and zero support from famous rappers and zero funding by billionaires, and basically just a bunch of moms and dads trying to save their children forced federal government action. I think this is a fascinating story that has kind of a happy ending. I find it really inspiring, I suppose, because everyday people figured out how to get the attention of the public and eventually the attention of government, and changed federal law. It really matters who's president, you know. But anyway, they changed federal law. They had to kidnap a couple of EPA officials. I'll tell you that story someday. But the volume of waste was dramatic. The photography about how depressed this area is famous now. So if you're into political history, you're going to read about this. If you're into political art, you're going to hear about this. If you're into relationships between the federal government, if you're into like the role of government, you're going to hear about this. Imagine this person put a sign on their front yard that said, "Wanted, healthy home for a toddler, inquire within." Right? Like, this person can't figure out how to keep their kids safe. The tragedy of what happens when your town is blighted, and this entire story comes down to this one lady, Lois Gibbs. You know, there's a lot of famous people that deserve our attention, but this is a person who's only famous in very few circles, and I think you should look up Lois Gibbs someday. Forgive me, I need you all to see my air quotes. Look up at the speaker view. She was just a housewife, and you know, nothing more powerful than a parent trying to protect their child. In response to Love Canal, the federal government created, now back to notes, the Superfund. It was a tax on the dirtiest industries. You remember the 5 Ps, right? You start taxing those industries that are the dirtiest. Like, I don't know, man, if there's going to be a spill, it was probably petroleum or plastic or pharmaceutical, right? You tax the 5 dirtiest industries to build a fund, the Superfund, to build a bank account that's only used to clean up after them. You know, I do think that we should charge more for teenagers to drive because we spend more to clean up their accidents. Superfund sites are land that's contaminated by some industrial process, but nobody's clearly responsible. And this happens all the time. Companies dissolve, people die, and who are you going to bust? Like, who's really at fault? If my grandfather polluted somebody's land, I don't know. I can't help with that. It's not my problem. By the way, I'm a school teacher. You could sue me for everything I'm worth, and I still wouldn't be able to clean up somebody else's mess, right? So the Superfund was meant to clean up those places that nobody was responsible for. By the way, this introduces a vocabulary term that you need to know. Brownfield, it's underlined on the screen, is land contaminated by industrial waste, by chemical waste. It's a brown field. The field is brown because it's contaminated by something. And Superfund is an interesting story. It built up like $130 billion. I can't remember, a lot of money. People were like starting to clean up sites all over the country. And then, you know, presidents matter. There was like one president who's like, no, you can't tax industries that haven't done something bad. And that's a fair argument. You know, you're taxing somebody, you're penalizing them for something that they haven't done. So you take away the incentive for somebody to be clean, right? Like, why would I bother installing these safety precautions at my paint factory if you're already going to tax me for doing pollution as a paint factory? You understand what I mean? So there was like a president who favored the business interest of not taxing them. Then there was a reauthorization of the Superfund Act, and they started to collect money again, and then it was closed again. So today, the money is being spent, but we keep adding more and more Superfund sites, right? Like, technology is getting better, people are developing more land, and we're like, oh, there's pollution underneath Jose's house. That should be a Superfund site. These are the most polluted places, by the way. We have a lot of chemical pollution in the United States, but Superfund sites are the most polluted. All right, Legacy of Love Canal. Important story. And don't forget Lois Gibbs, please. Okay. Now for number 25, your book does fine. The only thing that I wanted to add, there's like a table, 23.4, that lists the methods of disposing of hazardous material. Keep it on site, inject it into the ground, and so on. But there's one thing that your book, I don't think, mentions in that table, that today, this is just in the last few years, the single largest hazardous material in the US by volume, our most common hazmat by volume, is fracking fluid. After you inject fracking fluid into the ground, some fluid comes back with all those little natural gas bubbles. Remember, it's like opening up a shaken soda bottle. You get like fizz out of that. That fizz, once you remove the natural gas, that's used fracking fluid. And we have a lot of that. It's the primary user of fresh water in like 23 different states or something. It's a lot of volume. And your book, I don't think, mentions this, but we do what's called deep well injection, where you just find porous rock and you just go crank, 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 and you just inject it into the ground. Deep well injection. It's like a drill bit at the end of a pipe. You pull out the drill bit and you inject a bunch of fluid until that's full. Then you turn the pipe and you drill into the ground, and then you inject, you know, into soil that's porous. It's relatively clean way to do this. Some people worry about the threats to the groundwater, but usually these are in different layers. And some people worry about the increase in earthquakes, but there's very little evidence that it works. It does increase earthquakes, but not a lot. There's even an argument that it's good to increase earthquakes because you don't allow them to build up enough energy to make big earthquakes, right? You like let off steam, so to speak. You make little earthquakes. So anyway, your book didn't mention this, but I wanted to add it. That's a long video. That's the end of the loose ends.